A few weeks ago, Climate Trace has released its emissions data for January 2026, and as always, the headline number only tells part of the story. Global greenhouse gas emissions for January came in at 5.3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. That's an increase of 0.3% compared to January 2025. A small rise, but a rise nevertheless. However, there's one number in this month's data that genuinely stands out. Global methane emissions actually fell, down 1.3% year over year, and for a gas that's responsible for a significant chunk of near-term warming, that's a signal worth paying attention to. So let's work through the data together by country, by sector, and then by city, because that's where the real story starts to emerge. Starting with the major emitters, China remains the world's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and in January it produced around 1.5 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, up about 0.3% from the same month last year. A small increase, but still an increase. India also edged up slightly by about 0.4%. But here's what's interesting on the other side of that ledger. The United States recorded a notable decline, down 1.9% year over year. And Russia was also down 0.6%, and Indonesia fell slightly as well. And then there's the EU. As a bloc, it would rank as the fourth largest emitter in the world, and in January its emissions rose by 3.2% compared to last year. That's one of the more significant jumps in this month's data, and it's likely connected to something we'll come back to in a moment. Well, now the sector breakdown is where January 2026 gets a lot more interesting, because the pattern is almost the inverse of what we've been seeing in recent annual data. Three sectors that have historically been stubborn sources of growth actually declined this month. Fossil fuel operations fell by 2.4%, manufacturing edged down slightly, and power, the single largest emitting sector globally, dropped by 0.4%. On the other side, buildings saw the biggest jump of any sector, up 3.6% compared to January 2025. Transportation also rose by 2.8%, and this is where the EU number starts to make a lot more sense, because January 2026 was an exceptionally cold month across much of Europe and parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Cold winters drive heating demand, and heating demand drives building emissions. It's a reminder that monthly data always needs to be read with seasonal context in mind, because a single cold January doesn't erase a structural trend, but it can absolutely move the numbers in the short term. And finally, the city level data adds another layer of granularity to all of this. The highest emitting urban areas in January were Shanghai, Tokyo, New York, Los Angeles, and Houston. A list that reflects the concentration of industrial and economic activity in those regions. But the cities with the largest absolute increases tell a more specific story, because there's Anshan in China, Moscow in Russia, and Fukuyama in Japan. They all saw notable rises. Meanwhile, several Chinese cities like Baotou, Songyuan, and Luxing recorded the largest absolute declines, alongside Nagoya in Japan and Cincinnati in the United States. That pattern of Chinese cities appearing on both sides of the ledger in the same month is a reflection of just how large and varied Chinese industrial base really is. So then what's the takeaway from January 2026? The overall picture is one of modest growth, 0.3%, which continues the trend of slowing emissions increases we've identified in the annual data. The methane decline is a genuine positive signal. The drop in power sector emissions is encouraging, but the buildings spike is a reminder that weather can still dominate the monthly numbers in ways that make it difficult to separate short-term noise from long-term structural change. That's why watching these monthly trends together rather than in isolation matters. Each data point on its own is incomplete, but over time the patterns start to reveal where the system is actually heading. And increasingly, what those patterns are showing us is a global energy system that is slowly but surely beginning to bend. Methane is falling, power emissions are declining, the rate of overall growth continues to slow. None of these are world-changing headlines on their own, but together they are the kind of structural signals that, in systems that are as vast and complex as the global economy, tend to matter most. Our work, is far from done, but the direction in more places than before is starting to change. I'll be back very soon with the February 2026 data. And as always, Thank you very much for watching.